that down a little bit. Sure. Oh,
Good evening. Welcome to the University of Maryland Eastern Shore's continuing series commemorating Black History Month. I want to welcome all of those who are viewing virtually, whether you be here on the campus of University of Maryland Eastern Shore or wherever you might be. We want to thank you for being here in what should be a very stimulating, enlightening, and provocative discussion. I'm Dr. Marshall Stevenson. I'm the Dean of the School of Education, Social Sciences, and the Arts. And again, we want to thank you for coming. Politics and political parties. When we hear these terms today, controversy, conflict, fragmentation, division, polarization, they scream out at us. However, was there ever a time in American history when these words were not in play when talking about politics or political parties? Especially when looking at the African-American experience, the politics of slavery, the politics of emancipation, the politics of voting rights and citizenship are at the center. Political parties likewise have played a major role in shaping the literal integration of African-Americans into full citizenship in the United States. Whether it was the anti-slavery political parties of the mid-1800s, such as the Liberty Party or the Free Soil Party, or the segregationist parties of the mid-1900s, the Dixiecrats, for example. The influence of political parties and their platforms in regards to the African-American freedom struggle cannot be underestimated. Tonight, we're going to hear about the preeminent party of anti-slavery and emancipation, the Republican Party, sometimes referred to as the Party of Lincoln or the GOP, the Grand Old Party. Our speaker is highly qualified to tell us about the history of the party, as well as its present state of affairs. The Honorable Michael S. Steele was elected Lieutenant Governor of Maryland in 2003, and he made history as the first African-American elected to a statewide office, and again with his subsequent chairmanship of the Republican National Committee in 2009. As chairman of the RNC, Michael Steele was charged with revitalizing the Republican Party. A self-described Lincoln Republican, under Steele's leadership, the RNC broke fundraising records, over 198 million raised during the 2010 congressional cycle, and Republicans won 63 House seats, the biggest pickup since 1938. His commitment to grassroots organization and party building at the state and local levels produced 12 governorships and the greatest share of state legislative seats since 1928. As Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Mr. Steele's priorities included reforming the state's minority business enterprise program, improving the quality of Maryland's public education system, expanding economic development in the state, and fostering cooperation between government and faith-based organizations to help those in need. Mr. Steele's writings on law, business, and politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, thehill.com, thegrio.com, theroot.com, bet.com, the Journal of International Security Affairs, and the Catholic University Law Review, among others. He is the author of Right Now, a 12-step program for defeating the Obama agenda, which is a call to arms for grassroots America, and co-author of the Recovering Politicians 12-Step Program to Survive Crisis. Born at Andrews Air Force Base in Prince George's County, Maryland, Mr. Steele was raised in Washington, D.C. Upon graduating Johns Hopkins University, he entered the Order of St. Augustine, where he studied for the priesthood. He is a graduate of Georgetown Law Center, an Aspen Institute Rodel Fellow in Public Leadership, a University of Chicago Institute of Politics Fellow, and currently a Senior Fellow at Brown University's Institute for International and Public Affairs. Once Chairman Steele concludes his presentation, we will then take questions and answers from the audience. Honorable Michael Steele, you now have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stevenson. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back at UMES. I have fond memories of my time working with the institution and being a commencement speaker back, I believe it was 2014, somewhere around there. So it's a real pleasure to be with you. Certainly want to extend my warmest regards and best wishes to the faculty and the staff, and certainly President Heidi Anderson, and compliment her on her leadership, and certainly my friend, former mayor and senator, all around good guy, Jim Mathias, who did me the good luck of asking me to be a part of this conversation. So there are a number of places I want to start, but I want to actually start with the university, because one of the things that I think we oftentimes miss, and while there will be conversation around Republican Party and the African-American community and all of that, I think starting more broadly and understanding the role that institutions have played and how they have shaped, particularly our HBCUs have shaped our national narrative in so many ways that transcends politics. And I remember back when I was doing a trade mission to South Africa, Uganda, and a number of other places on the African continent, I wanted UMES to be a part of it. And Dr. Emmanuel Akwa at the time was very instrumental in helping us make the kinds of connections between our Republican administration and our African roots through this university, and the enterprise that UMES brings nationally in areas of technology and agriculture, and a host of other industries. And so we wanted to showcase that, and we did. And I just want to, it's just a great memory of mine to recognize UMES and its very significant role in our state. So we talk about our politics today, and it's one thing you'll learn about me is I'm very direct and blunt. So be prepared. It's gotten me into trouble in politics, but my mom always told me to be myself and be honest about that. And so I want to be at all times. And a lot of our politics today is downright ugly. It is poisonous. It is offensive. It is racist. It is ignorant. It is formed out of fear and anger. We've witnessed that transformation, not just in the 2016-2020 cycle, folks. This goes back 30 years, 40 years, 60 years, where you can go and pinpoint at various points along that timeline where those little seeds were planted that would germinate and now have sprouted their ugly selves. But it used not always be that way in terms of the relationship between African Americans and the Republican Party. A lot of Republicans like to say, well, we're the party of Lincoln, we freed the slave. Well, there's so much more to it than that. And it does a disservice not only to the community, but to the relationship between African Americans and the Republican Party, when that's the tagline. You just go right to that. And what it misses is the fact that the party was born out of the human struggle over slavery. The party was born out of the tensions between whether we would be a country that honored the words written in its founding documents in the Constitution and even in the Declaration of Independence about free men living freely, or would it be a lie? Would it reflect a lie in many respects that in fact some men are free? And so the battle within the Whig Party at that time was over this issue of, do we fight and push back up against slavery, or do we accede to it and give it a little ground but not a lot of ground? And out of that internal struggle within the Whig Party, where there was this conscientious struggle over the founders wrote these words: we are not free if we are enslaving others. We cannot be completely free if we're enslaving others. And that led to a breakup of the party. And out of that Whig party, out of that great internal debate was formed the Republican Party. And from there, the battle lines were drawn leading up to the Civil War. It was roughly 6 years before we entered into that great Civil War. And during that time, you had individuals, ironically and interestingly enough, like Frederick Douglass and other African Americans who were helping to shape the narrative around what this emerging party would say in this space. And we would later see that influence play out in the thinking of Abraham Lincoln during the war. Because remember, Abraham Lincoln was much more comfortable with, okay, let bygones be bygones, don't let it spread. I just don't want a war. We just don't need to go to battle over this. And it took some prodding and it took some pushing and pulling to get him to really understand the full implications of that position versus one that recognized that the Constitution mattered and was applicable to Black men and women as much as it was to white men and women. And so you have these early struggles for the party that led inexorably to Lincoln coming to that crucible moment where he said, basically, damn it to hell, all right, we're just gonna emancipate everybody. and it's because of the influence of Black men and women in his life, in his orbit. There's the story by Joyce Kearns Goodwin, this historian that's now playing on the History Channel about Lincoln. And there are a number of scenes where Lincoln is talking to the Black staff in the White House. And you listen to how it's characterized. It's a very accurate characterization of his relationship with Black people around him. It was personal, it was relatable, it was it was, they were companions. He understood it, and he listened, and they talked to him and shared their insights. So you can see Lincoln, given all the other things that he had to deal with around prosecuting a war, also having to deal with laying down what a lot of us in this generation of Republicans would latch on to as Lincoln Republicanism. And that is this identification of the power of the individual, the power of economy, the power of actually caring for those around you. And there's a very strong libertarian streak to it about the limitations with regard to the limitations of government in the daily lives of citizens. And so all these elements and influences were things that Lincoln picked up from his engagement and his encounters with Black people. And it moved him in such a way that he would ultimately write the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as history will tell you, was the last thing he wanted to do. And so you from those early beginnings, you have this very important relationship that was formed between the African American community and this new thing, this new party that would stand for the freedoms of all Americans. And it would lead the party to fight for the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. It would lead the party to support and promote actually the first affirmative action bill, post-Reconstruction, 40 acres and a mule, to make sure that the freed slave, because what we saw immediately happening after, and this is a consequence of Lincoln's assassination, and the fact that he put a Southern Democrat on his ticket as vice president, you saw the sort of taking back of that progress, the stripping down of that progress, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan as a militarized response, if you will, to a Black freedom, and so you had these elements going on, while at the same time you had the party trying to carve out the space for African Americans to enjoy as much of the freedoms of the land as all others could. So there is that arc that starts and that lasts for quite some time. And we laugh today, we talk about African Americans vote 90-10 Democrat. Well, they voted 95-5 Republican up until about 1932, 33, until the age of Roosevelt and of course the Great Depression and the economic hardships, the imposition of Jim Crow, and quite honestly, the lack of a consistent voice by Republicans to push back against what was happening in the South, in the Jim Crow South at that time. And while a lot of Northern Republicans, the Northeastern Republicans in particular, were adamant in their support, that did not translate down the coast and across the country. And so you began to see, as hardships prevailed on a maturing Black electoral class, that their interest grew, but their relationship with the Republican Party did not. It became a little bit stagnant. And there were political calculations that were subsequently being made by Republicans to figure out how to win electorally presidential elections. And so you have these political tensions that begin to come in and reshape this relationship in a way that was less than pure, less than authentic. When you're starting to realize, hey, we win the presidency by going to the South. Because remember, the Democrats owned the South. They held down the South. Republicans largely were fixated in the North. And so, but the presidency had to go through Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Tennessee. And Republicans were having a hard time winning office there because of their pro-civil rights position, because of the role they played in the emancipation of Black men and women, the role they played in giving them equal footing under the Constitution. A lot of white males especially resented that. And so they tended not to vote and support Republicans who supported the Negro. And so you had this kind of patchwork of elections. And when you got to the age of Roosevelt, where it became very clear that that struggle for political dominance would become more difficult, you began to see the party move away. And I've always argued it was a big mistake. So much so that by the time you get to the 1950s, you have emerging inside the party a calculation that began to materialize itself and manifests itself ultimately in the election in 1964. But even before that, you had the break when Martin Luther King was sitting in that jail cell, and Daddy King wanted him to be free, and he wanted help. He turned initially to Republicans because Republicans ran the Senate, and silence. He turned to Kennedy, silence. And ultimately, it was the likes of Robert F. Kennedy who impressed upon John Kennedy to do something that ultimately he did. And that began to cement the break in the civil rights struggle, as Republicans basically did nothing and stood silent at critical times where African Americans felt they needed that help and that support that went beyond passing an amendment to the Constitution. But now we were in the nuts and bolts fight for actualizing our freedom, actualizing our rights. And the party, quite frankly, stood silent until Goldwater, who began the drumbeat around an antithesis to the civil rights movement as it was emerging, and stood in the hall at the Republican convention and declared his lack of support for civil rights, and that as president, that would not be a priority for him. And that then moved itself to Nixon, where, again, getting back to winning presidential politics, once Johnson had signed off on the Kennedy legacy of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in 64 and 65, with the help, ironically, of Republican senators, white male voters began to resent the Democratic Party and move away from the Democratic Party. In fact, it was one of the reasons, because Kennedy was hinting back in 63 at the urgency of his brother to embrace more of the civil rights movement and to begin to do some bigger, bolder things. It drew him to Texas to shore up the Democratic Party in Texas that November of 63, to go down there and to make everybody feel okay about his presidency. And as history, as we know, the history turns out, he would not see the completion of that work, and it instead would fall to Lyndon Johnson, who was a segregationist, who was by no means a captain of civil rights, but like Lincoln, was moved by events and by Martin Luther King, and we have the tapes of his discussion with King to press forward on this issue. What that meant for Republicans was a door opening that Richard Nixon, the chairman of the GOP, and other party officials at the time would call the Southern Strategy. And it is that Southern Strategy which we have now seen come to its fruition in this age. In fact, what you've seen since then is just sort of a stair-step breakaway from that relationship that began in the 1850s. And now by the 1980s, with Reagan and with others, it began to disintegrate completely. As much lip service as there was given to the party, to the Black relationship by the Republican Party, actualizing that was not a priority. So my predecessor, Ken Melvin, was the first chairman to go to the NAACP at their invitation, because all other chairmen had refused to speak at the NAACP National Convention. He went and he declared at that time and apologized for the Southern Strategy, for the alienation of the Black vote by Republicans around the country. When I became chairman in 2009, I was invited to speak to the NAACP, and I went and declared that the Southern Strategy was over, that this party under my chairmanship and leadership would stand in the lineage of Abraham Lincoln, not Richard Nixon, that we would embrace a full-throated agenda that reconciles our relationship with the African-American community, and at the same time, close the book, shut down, and put out in the trash that Southern Strategy. And as you can see, they really responded well to that. They fired me 2 years later. So that speaks volumes. But here's the rub on all of that. When you stop and think about that journey, that arc, what it really boils down to is relationships. And here's the thing that I could never get party officials around the country to understand. You can elect a Black man chairman of your party, but at the end of the day, it is what the chairman and the central committee members and the Republicans on the ground in communities around the country where I don't live and work and play, do live, work, and play, and how they engage with that community. And so while you want to see this, you go out and you say, well, Blacks are conservative because they go to church on Sunday. Okay, is that the standard? Really? Is that how you're going to do this? No, you have to engage directly. And the party gave up on that engagement. And that is one of the great frustrations of, I know, for someone like Ken, and certainly for someone like me, as much as we try to remoor it towards the idea that was formed and put into place at its founding, recognizing the individual freedoms of all Americans, but in a particular way, the relationship that we have with the community of color that, yes, we helped free, but more importantly, we believed in, and that we thought had brought value to this American experiment. That walking away from that, for me, has been one of the great frustrations to watch, as we have fallen back into this sort of strategy that preys on the fears of white people, plays up stereotypes of African Americans, and it's encapsulated in the rebuttal to Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, meaning that life that you're talking about as Black people, what makes you think that's more valuable than a white life? Well, then you're missing the conversation, as many of us tried to emphasize. So you can see this struggle within the party today emerging in the democracy space around issues of race, around issues of economy, around issues of culture. Watch the reaction of Republicans to the Super Bowl halftime show. Watch the reaction of Republicans to the impending nomination of a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And you begin to see that the party has moved away from, and wants to move away from, that legacy, that history, that relationship, in which if you looked at the last Republican president, George W. Bush, who signed, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, engaged directly with the community on issues of education, what he did for the African continent during the AIDS epidemic and crisis, those strategies no longer apply. Those strategies are no longer important. And I think it's going to make a very difficult journey for the Republican Party going forward. When you look at the Black men and women who have made a difference, who have been in the ear culturally, politically, scientifically, educationally, in the ears of Republicans and Democrats. Frances Ellen Harper is, among the first African-American women published in American, a Marylander. Vivian Theodore Thomas, a pioneer in cardiac surgery out of Johns Hopkins University, African-American man. And one of our own here on the Eastern Shore, Fanny Brickhead, who just recently passed from Snow Hill, Maryland, and an alum of UMES, an advocate in civil rights, a pioneer in promoting and empowering communities here in our own backyard. Her daughter is the Maryland National Guard Brigadier General Janine Brickhead. These are pioneers who are part of our history. And whether it is connected to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, I think the more important story for us to tell is our own. And so when we see in this space right now, and it's a fight that I'm going through with a number of my friends inside the party on critical race theory. When I see white folks get upset when we start telling our story, that emboldens and empowers me to tell it more and to say it louder. And so I guess when I'm looking at this narrative of a party that's had a long history, an up and down history, a difficult history at times with my community, partly why I stay connected to it. One, I know it ticks them off because they just rather I go away. But most importantly, because who's going to tell the story? Who's going to tell the story? And who's going to hold up the mirror And so to the students of UMES, the faculty, the staff, it's, you know, the people who supported the community as a whole, tell this story. That's why I wanted to start by sharing a little bit of my history with you at UMES, working with you in Africa, working with you here in Maryland, being a part of the legacy that you're building. Tell that story, because that, at the end of the day, is ultimately how history is defined, how history is shared. And so I don't know what the Republican Party is going to look like a year from now, 10 years from now, because I certainly don't recognize it right now. But what I do know, for as long as it insists on behaving and performing the way it has, there's got to be a countervailing force. It's got to be a force that pushes back up against it. And out of that struggle, and there are many of us inside the party who are engaged in this work, something will come. It either will be a new party, very much as we saw the Republican Party grow out of that struggle within the Whigs at that time, or something completely different. But at all instances, as an African American, as a Black man, I will be in that room, in that space, telling our story and connecting it to whatever emerges. Connecting it to whatever emerges, because that is not just the future, but it is also how we shape and tell our history.
Thank you very much for that enlightening discussion. I would like to ask now for any students or faculty or others tuning in, if you have a question for Chairman Steele, unmute yourself and ask that question of him.
I have one if they don't.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, Mr. Steele.
I can.
I'm wondering if you've had conversations with current members of the US Senate, Republican members, to discuss what you think they ought to be doing as opposed to what they are doing in terms of obstruction of all work.
Yes, and this is how this conversation typically goes. Oh, I know, you know, and it's very frustrating. And we want to get these things done. That's pretty much how it goes. There's no seriousness right now to do anything that would put them sideways with Donald Trump. There's no seriousness in putting out a forward-leaning agenda for the nation. I gave you Mitch McConnell 2 weeks ago when asked if Republicans take back the Senate in 2023, what's your agenda? What are you going to do? And he looked at us and he said very honestly, I don't know, just to wait and find out. We're talking about a party that has no platform right now. It cannot tell you what it is, what it believes. We have a party that is embracing a rabid dictator in Russia, giving him more power than our own president, giving him more space on national television and in media than patriots here at home who are trying to stave off a war. And yet they go on and Twitter and TV, and their response is Biden is weak. Trump did better than Biden. Putin was afraid of Trump, which is actually laughable. But that's where the party is. So I've had conversations with a number of them, members of the House as well. Most don't want to talk to me, because they know how that conversation is going to go, because there will be a lot of choice words used to describe them and their actions by me. But the ones I do speak to, I get a roll of the eyes or a nodding of the head and an acknowledgement that at the end of the day, they're weak and there's nothing they can do. And I can assure you this, that if they take back the House and the Senate, don't look for any business in this country to get done. It will be 2-year run up to the 2024 presidential election in which Donald Trump, if Republicans have, certainly if they have both chambers, will run again. And there will be individuals prosecuted. There will be trials held and people brought up on charges from the January 6th committee to folks like myself who've spoken out against Trump. And what I find more daunting than anything else is that right now, every poll that I've seen says the country wants to do that. And that's scary, that people would reelect a party that basically tried to overthrow the government.
I think one of your friends, Dr. Emmanuel Aqua,
I saw my man.
yeah, has a question for you or a comment. Unmute yourself.
Hello, Micah.
Hey, Doctor, how you doing, man?
Fine, how are you?
I am well, sir. It's good to be in your presence. I had to give you a shout out at the beginning, baby, because you took care of me when we went to Africa and taught me a lot, my friend.
Yes, thank you very much for that. That is the comment I wanted to make, that I'm glad in this presentation, you began by telling part of your story in connection with UMES, story that many people don't know. And Dr. Stevenson, I promise you, I will tell you, work with you to make sure we tell the rest of the story, because many of you will don't know. Michael and his governor at their time helped us. Without them, we wouldn't have the pharmacy program.
Yeah.
Without them, the engineering program would not have happened. But that story is not told well. And I'll work with Michael and you to tell the story, to let them know that, yes, UMES, a small school, had worked with the Republican Party in those days to put the university and the state on the world map. Thank you very much, my friend.
No, thank you, Doc. I appreciate you very, very much. And you're right. I mean, we made a commitment, and I was fortunate enough, Governor Ehrlich knew my passion for HBCUs and education, and allowed me to take that, our educational system as a whole, from K right through graduate school, into my portfolio. And I focused on our HBCUs here in the state, and the pharmacy program and other programs at UMES, the work we were able to do at Coppin, Bowie, all of these were part of our commitment to show that it was important to put not just our policies into work, but our values. And to demonstrate how much we value UMES and the role that UMES played in a number of areas, certainly even back at that time, recognizing the relationship with the University of Cape Coast and a number of programs that were born out of that trip that we did. UMES, I think, is just really done inspiringly well, and I'm so proud and so excited for the success of the university.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Karen, you have your hand raised. You have a question.
It's actually my husband.
Hi, I'm Mike Shealy. I'm pleased to be on here. This is a great opportunity. Lieutenant Governor Steele, what do we need to do in this state to begin to get candidates like yourself out in front of the public? That's where it all starts, and I'm anxious about Mr. Hogan leaving the governor's office.
Right.
So give us at least the first stop on the trail.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a difficult question, because for me, I can only speak really for me, this was part of a calling to public service. I as Dr. Stevenson noted, studied for the priesthood. My original plan, before God revealed the rest of the story, was to go into the priesthood. And I spent a number of years in a monastery and brought that experience to what I would do in public life. And I had a lot of people tell me at the time that I would not be successful as a politician because I cared too much. And I said to them, that's exactly why I will be successful as a politician. And it just really kind of, in a stark way, made me realize how we look at these men and women that we empower with our vote to serve our interest and to be there for us. And I'm very, very clear and very harsh about this. And I say this as someone who was a county chairman in Prince George's County, state chairman here in Maryland, and national chairman. Unelect the bad ones. And for heaven's sake, don't elect them in the first place. Use our collective judgment. When you see a candidate and hear a candidate, just put the party labels aside for a moment and just listen to what they're saying. And if you cannot hear yourself reflected in their words, if you cannot see yourself reflected in their actions, don't elect them. Don't elect them. Because you know, if a guy or a gal came up to you and said, if you elect me, I'm gonna put your neighbor's kids in a cage. Or if you elect me, I'm going to go out and build a wall around our community. If you elect me, it will be the fullest expression that there really are fine people on both sides. You wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. But you know instinctively, when you look at someone and you listen to them, you can see their leadership, you can feel their leadership. And what we have right now are a bunch of people who don't know how to lead. They can't, they're too mired in themselves. The first thing I learned when I entered the monastery, and it was a harsh lesson, was dying to oneself, meaning giving up the thing that you love the most, you, so that you can love others. And the way that manifests itself is when they took my car from me. I show up at the monastery and all the brothers come out and we greet and we love and hug and say hello. And the master of the house comes up and said, give me the car keys. I was like, why am I giving you my car keys? And he says, because this is for the community. This is part, you now get to share this part of what you own with us. That's leadership. That's how leadership is formed, an appreciation of what that feels like, what that means to people. And right now we don't have that. So I start by saying to people, look and listen very carefully at what people are saying to you. If they're giving you a laundry list of promises, just move on, because none of it's going to happen. If they show their authentic self, if they show their vulnerabilities, if they're willing to admit, I don't know it all, but I'm going to lean on you, I'm going to lean on these people, I'm going to lean on this community, I'm going to lean on this state to help me, then you begin to get a sense of how they're going to lead, that they realize their fallibility, they realize the awesome responsibility of representing you. And I hope we see that. I hope we see that. I think those are traits that Larry Hogan and Bob Ehrlich and others have exhibited at times, and they were, supported by people. But today I look around and I'm concerned. So we'll see what happens. I know on my side, everybody wants to please Trump. Well, that's the last thing on this planet I want to do. And it should be the last thing you would want anyone coming into office to want to do, to please one person. So it's a hard one. That's a tough question, but it is very much part of how individuals come into understanding and appreciating what they're looking for in leadership. Who do you want to best represent and reflect my values, my ideas, not, oh yeah, I'm pro-life and I'm pro-choice, but who's going to have respect for life, period, and however you find it, in whatever forms it is. A person in prison's life is just as valuable and needs to be attended to as the person who's in the womb, or the person who, is sitting behind a very comfortable job. Everybody has value, and our elected leaders need to stop picking and choosing who they value more than others.
Anyone else have a question for Chairman Steele? I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Given everything that you said tonight, you've painted a very broad yet concise history of African Americans in the Republican Party. If I was a young person on a college campus here at UMES, for example, and I heard you present this history, how could I ever consider wanting to be a Republican?
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I'd recommend it. And that's hard for me to say. I tell you why. As a young man, 1976 was the first presidential election I could vote in. I was 17 that summer, turned 18 2 weeks before the general election, so I could vote that year. And I remember sitting down with my mom and having the conversation. I grew up in DC, so I come from a family of Democrats. We had one aunt who was a Republican and no one ever talked to her. So I figured there must be something. I don't know what's up with her, but okay. But she's a sweetheart. My aunt Josephine, I love her to death. She's a sweetheart. And but I sat down with my mom, and my mom said to me, look, don't be a Democrat because I'm a Democrat. Go out and find out for yourself. Go out and figure out who you are and where you want to be. And I did. And I went and I looked at both parties. I studied the history of both parties. And certainly the history of the early history of the Democratic Party is steeped in racism and ugliness and hatred. The early history of the Republican Party is not. The recent history at that time of the Republican Party was indifference and a rather coldness, calculation towards my community. Democrats were rather paternalistic and throwing government as the solution at that time, among other things. And so I was rather torn, but at the end of the day, I latched on to Lincoln. I latched on to that idea that related back to how my mother raised me in Washington, D.C., in a city that was still segregated in many parts. And yet she said I had worth and value, and that I had every right to realize my dream just as anyone else did. And that made sense to me. And so I joined the party that summer. And when I told my mother, of course, she looked at me and said, why'd you go do that? I think she was secretly wishing I'd become a Democrat, but I'm like, well, you raised me well. You raised me to think for myself, and I did. But it was, that 17-year-old kid who looked at the party and saw some of the conflicted history and some of the difficulties, had that light still lifted up. And for all of his foibles and the problems that came with Reagan, he did speak, he did connect in a way as a real life candidate. In 76, I was inspired by a lot of what he said in his losing battle for the presidency in 76. And so there were men and women who spoke in a way that reflected a set of values and principles and ideas that I can relate back to my mom and to my family and how I was brought up. And it really kind of speaks to this, you're not raised Republican or Democrat, you just raised a certain way, right? You can attach all that to it later, but it just raised a certain way. And so today I asked myself, what would that 17-year-old kid do? I think he probably, or she would probably be more of an independent, because I think both parties have shown themselves to be flawed to the point of almost difficult to tolerate and stomach at times. I see this emergence on college campuses now with particularly this generation of 18, 20, 25-year-olds who are very, very clear about their ideals and about how the system must work, not should work, must work. And they're willing to go in and change that. I give you, you know, the students at Stoneman Douglas High School who taught not just the state of Florida, but the country, what we should do in a moment like a mass shooting. And they went out and they fought and they changed the laws in Florida, and they've become a consistent and steady voice in exhibiting leadership. And I think that's going to be the challenge and the opportunity for young people today as they look at both these parties. Now, to be honest, I've always been an advocate for a multi-party system. I've never liked just two parties at the table and in the room. Because what I know, having been inside, is that's all the two parties want. They don't want to open this process up. They don't want the competition of ideas, and they certainly don't want the competition over voters. And I think that's what we need right now. I think Republicans need to begin to feel the pain from their decisions and their actions in how they have responded at times to the needs of Americans, whether it's at our border, whether it's in suburban America, whether it's on the streets of Charlottesville. There's a price to be paid for that. When you look at my ancestors and say they are from a shithole country, there's a price to be paid for that. And we need to hold them accountable. The same on the Democratic side, the paternalism, the lack of, you know, of serious interest in promoting what's necessary and required for the advancement of people that go beyond what just the government can do or what spending one more dollar will get you. Recognizing and tapping into that spirit that people have, that's innate in them, that I can do for me and mine, right? And it reminds me of what my mother told me when she was challenged by her family and our parish priest that she didn't go on welfare. And they tried to get her to go on welfare after my dad died when I was around 4 or 5 years old. And she refused to do it. And her response was, you know, I don't want the government raising my child. I'll raise my child. I'll figure this out. I'll work this out. That's not to say that when you're really up against the wall, those programs aren't important and you need them and access them, but you can't strip away that choice out of the box, because it's innate in people to want to find a way to pull themselves through and to make it right for them and their family. Thurgood Marshall said it very clearly. You know, Republicans like to say, yeah, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But Thurgood Marshall reminded us, yes, it's important to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but every once in a while, you're gonna need somebody to help you. And that's the understanding of, at least for me as a young man, in shaping my identity around the role of government and the role of society and community and the individual, was that I'm okay. I can do it on my own, but I know that when I can't, there will be someone there. There will be something there to help me. So it's not bad. You know, government role and involvement is not bad. But what we're finding now, young people are sort of figuring that out, and they're creating these lanes, these spaces where they're challenging both parties, I think, appropriately, to better understand what their limitations are. And most importantly, and just as well, equally, and most importantly, what the opportunities are. So it's hard to say what that 17-year-old, 18-year-old kid would say today, looking at the Republican Party as it's currently constituted. I couldn't invite them to that. knowing that right now we stand for very little that reflects Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, any of that.
Elizabeth, you had a question.
Hi, thank you very much, Michael. It's been excellent tonight. I thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed seeing you hosting last night on
Ah.
MSNBC. You were fabulous.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Is this a new door and opportunity for a full show?
We'll see. We'll see. You know, I started, they approached me about starting to host some of the shows in the early part of 2021. And then I had this crazy idea I wanted to run for governor. And so I took time off about 5 months. And so I had to step off of my contract because I was considering a run for public office. And so now that I'm back, after deciding to not do that, they're like, well, we got some shows we like you to host. I'm like, okay, let's do it. So we'll see what it means, but it's a lot of fun. And I enjoy that side. I like the conversation. So anything I can do to press that, I'm all about it.
Well, I appreciate your voice on the show, and you were fabulous. So
Thank you.
I hope the door is wide open for you there, and look forward to seeing you more.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So wanted to have two other questions. One is with the Lincoln Project.
Mhm.
And what is your role and thought, and what do you see that being a catalyst for the midterms?
Sure.
And then
I'll do that real quick. So Lincoln Project, I still work with these guys. I'm no longer an advisor because of what I do on TV. I can't be that directly involved. When I was an advisor during the 2020 campaign, again, I stepped off of my contract with MS and did that with them. And they really changed the nature of the game in many respects in 2020. And I think you'll see the same level of engagement going forward in 22. What's at stake, of course, is the House of Representatives. 5 seats separate Democrats and Republicans. History and the census, as well as redistricting, tells us that the Republicans should pick up somewhere between 25 and 30 seats in this cycle. I'm not a firm believer in that necessarily, because I think there's some things that I know, will play a factor in how voters approach the fall elections. Certainly what we're seeing happening right now in Ukraine will be one of those factors. What we see happening in the next week with the announcement of a new Supreme Court justice will be a factor. And the decisions and rulings of that court come June will be an enormous factor, not to mention all the other little pieces that are going to be out there around the litigation involving Donald Trump and others. So you've got this storyline that's already kind of set, but then there are these variables that can change it. And I think Lincoln Project will be doing everything they can to play up those variables and to push them out and to remind people that this fight is still about democracy at the end of the day. And it's about, going back to what I was saying before, electing men and women who are in good faith with that democracy and with the American people, and who value their country more than their party. And so I think that that's going to be interesting to watch how that plays itself out over the next few months. And I think Lincoln Project will very much be a part of it.
I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate your value system and talking about it. The last is, you mentioned Ukraine. What are you talking within your family about Ukraine and what it means to your family and your life and really our country at this point?
Well, it's hard. It's hard. Ukraine is unique in its space in Eastern Europe. It has been making struggled steps at times towards becoming a democracy, and is looking to the West for help in doing that, which is why they want to be a part of NATO. And I get the politics around and the dynamics of that. But where we are right now is, I think it's going to be a real test for us, Elizabeth, in terms of how we as Americans, look at democracy writ large and whether or not we think it's okay for an aggressive world power to an autocratic state to just roll up on a country and take it, claim it. And there's a lot to be said about the mistake. And I think Joe Biden, I know privately and quietly his opposition to the Obama position in 2014 when Crimea fell. And he does not want to have that happen again. So I think that we've, as Americans, have to recognize that whether we want to be or not, we're all kind of connected and we're going to feel it. We're going to feel it at the gas pumps. We're going to feel it maybe in other ways, in technology. But for me personally, yeah, I'll pay a little bit more at the gas pump to keep Putin in check. And I'll pay a little bit more for an iPhone to keep Putin in check. That's me, and that's the conversation in my household. And I know it's going to be different in others, but I value this proposition way too much. I think it's way too important for us as a nation that's reemerged on the international stage as a leader. What Joe Biden has done in pulling together NATO, if you just go back a year and understand where NATO was, it was fractured. It was moving in different directions. It was exactly as Putin wanted it to be. And the one thing, and I know this in talking to some national security folks as recently as today, the one thing Putin did not count on was Biden's ability to do that. And so now he's got to play his card a lot harder. And we'll see how the US responds. But I just say to the American people, let's stand with our president. Let's stand with the League of Nations, if you will, the community of nations that want to fight against totalitarianism. Because if he's successful in this, tell me, where does it stop? Mm-hmm. Poland? Where does it stop? And so you've got to understand that there are consequences if we don't stand and draw that line and say, no, this is not how it's going to go. And Putin is an old school Cold War guy. He's KGB, old KGB. And the one thing that pissed him off more than anything else was when Gorbachev tore down that wall and put up the white flag on the Cold War. And he has been fighting ever since to re-engage on that battlefield. And I'll pay some more at the gas pump to keep that from happening.
I will too. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate all your comments too.
Can you take a few more questions?
Yes.
Marie, you have a question.
Yes. Chairman Steele, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us. I'm going to first start by saying I miss seeing you at Holy Family Church for Mass.
Yes, I haven't been back since COVID.
Yes, since COVID, yes. I know you, whenever you came to Mass, you caused a stir. We were all looking around, looking for you. Yes, so, and
I'll be back. I promise I'll be back.
Thank you. Now that I heard your bio, now I understand how, you got to be such a staunch Catholic. So my question is going to be related to your values. Think about the fact that the Republican Party puts abortion issue as a priority. Right. Yes, there's capital punishment that affects a lot of the minorities, and some of those being killed cannot be. So what is your comment on that? Because it causes a lot of confusion, especially amongst those of us Catholics, and we have our own personal values. I choose not to judge anybody, right. But at it as being, hypocritical when they are going to be killing people through capital punishment and yet still talking about abortion. I think both of them should go hand in hand.
I would agree with you, Marie. In fact, it is wholly inconsistent for me to claim a right to life and then in the next breath claim a right to kill.
Yeah.
And so I have been, because I am pro-life, to use the political terminology, I need to be consistent in that value. And so therefore I've not supported the death penalty. In fact, as Lieutenant Governor, when the death penalty reemerged, the use of the death penalty reemerged during our administration, I was very grateful to Governor Ehrlich, who allowed me to voice my values and my views on the issue. I had access to all of the case material relevant to each incarcerated individual who was on death row. And yeah, it is hard to read some of these narratives of the horrible things that these individuals did. But my faith teaches me that God did not give me the power to make that judgment.
Yes.
And so there are other ways to exact a punishment for the earthly crime committed, and leave to the Lord to deal with that long-term pain, baby, because that's a whole nother story. But I recognize and appreciate that not everyone has that value and that not everyone believes that. So for me, it is always a matter of being consistent in my view, to be strong in my articulation of that view, not to convince you I'm right and you're wrong, but to convince you in the moment to think about it a different way, to consider a different aspect or a different approach. And a lot of folks in the pro-life community love to espouse their fight for the child in the womb, but they're wholly silent about the child living down on the corner in the shanty, right? They're wholly silent about the child sitting in the classroom who hasn't had anything to eat for 2 days. So you've got to be consistent in that value, that Deuteronomy says to us, choose life. And it's not just in the context of life in the womb, but choose life living. How do we empower people to live? How do we help them live? And so that's kind of been sort of my root in a lot of this. And I know we're now going to have very painful and torturous debates on abortion this summer and fall, once the Supreme Court makes this decision. I don't know what it is, but I suspect it likely will weaken, if not outright overturn Roe. And so it is going to be incumbent on us to be prepared to come to the table with something else, to recognize that we're going to waste a lot of time fighting over something. And in the meantime, lives will be damaged and affected, that if we focus on caring for the living among us, regardless of how we find them, whether they're in jail or in poverty or living their best life, that we need to, as a people of faith, need to be concerned about their life and the fruits of that life as much as we possibly can. So we'll see what happens, but that's kind of how I approach it.
Dr. Das, you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Das, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you so much for taking my question.
Sure.
I'm looking back, looking forward. I teach in the business program. So I have a question about where you see business and the Republican Party at this time. I see companies taking a stand on social issues. I'm seeing over 100 CEOs signing the voting rights, position. Are you seeing business moving away from the Republican Party, or is the Republican Party moving away from business?
Well, the one thing that we know to be true in politics is that no one ever leaves their party. Their party leaves them. And that is, I think that is very much the case here among a number of businesses and business leaders. Look, the party right now is antithetical to the U.S. Chamber. They're getting into fights with the U.S. Chamber and with Chamber of Commerces around the country. And you and I know that historically that has been a very, very close connection, pro-business, low taxes, less regulation, all of that good stuff. Well, now because the cultural requirements, the social requirements are such that, going back to this idea of accountability, you now are being held accountable for how you spend your money as a business, where you spend your money, what you're investing in, what you're getting behind. So if you are putting money into a business or an interest that is found to be racist, the culture, the society now responds to that. They no longer see that, well, that's just business and they'll do what they need to do, and I'm going to go out here and march against racism. Well, that racism is there when you look at it and you're looking at a boardroom and the room is filled with 10, around the table are 10 white men of a certain age. People are now more socially conscious, and the Republican Party apparently doesn't like that. They somehow equated that honesty, holding folks accountable, with wokeness, and all such other things, to be somewhat negative. And so there is a strain now among a number of the business leaders in the country. As we've seen this play out on a number of fronts, from the tech side out in Silicon Valley to Wall Street in New York, you have this ongoing tension where businesses and business owners in particular, largely driven by their employees. And among the employees, that generation I was just talking about was coming in who are like really politically engaged, and that Gen X crowd. Those folks are pushing for this honesty and this authenticity in a way, and changing the culture inside of a lot of businesses, recognizing that unlike those of us who are part of that, that business experience of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, where we were loyal to the business, but business wasn't so loyal to us, right? They now recognize that and say, well, we know y'all not about loyalty, but we do know what you're about. You're about the bottom line. And so in looking at your bottom line, we see you are doing certain things that are antithetical or harmful to the larger cause of the community. And, they're paying attention to that. And Republicans are repelled by that for some reason. It has surprised me how much and how quickly they have moved off of some of their business alliances and relationships around these issues. And you see some of that tension, with individuals like Colin Kaepernick, or with what we just saw in voting in Georgia, where companies were held to account for their donations to candidates who supported overturning the election. And, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that, because it's like my mama said, well, you show your behind, everyone gets to see it, right? So what are you mad at? Why are you mad at somebody? I mean, so I don't have a problem with that. And if you're going to back a candidate who advocated for overthrowing the election of 2020, and I'm going to put on internet how much you wrote as a check and so forth, you can't be mad at me. But they used to do that and get away with it because no one paid attention to how businesses invested their money politically or socially. And now they're paying attention, and to their credit, businesses are responding favorably for the most part.
Last question for you.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Barrett Gaines. Unmute yourself.
There you
Yeah,
go.
it was unmuting was a two-step process. Mr. Steele, this is really a great pleasure because I normally just watch you. You listen, you're on MSNBC and I enjoy you very much. So it's fun it's really cool that you kind of came to speak to us. I teach history at UMS, so it's really cool that your talk here tonight was so historical and so focused, because that really is the big question. That's the elephant in the room. What are you doing in the Republican Party? I'm from Washington, D.C. as well, and I've always had a theory, and now you've put it to rest, but my theory was that Black Republicans are like Washingtonians who like the Dallas Cowboys. They just like to be different and like to be special and like to have everybody look at them and talk and say, hey, there's that guy who likes the Cowboys. So, but I understand. Now, my question is, how lonely are you, right? We had Lieutenant Governor, the current Lieutenant Governor speaking.
Boyd,
And he is very quiet around these issues that you are not quiet about. Now, is that because he's still in office? Were you equally as quiet when you were Lieutenant Governor? Do you expect him to speak more? Do you expect him to be more honest and be more forthcoming when he's no longer in office? And also, how creative are Black Republicans getting? Those who think like you, not those who are,
right.
following, like goose stepping behind, but how many are there like you? And do you have, like, I think about the Black Panther Party and their way of revolutionizing, being revolutionaries by going into the middle of things, like going into the Capitol strapped with guns because they could, right? Wouldn't it be revolutionary to have just a whole bunch of Black people join the Republican Party? Now, what kind of creativity and who do you talk to about this kind of stuff?
So on the first part, I've known Boyd. Boyd and I went to high school together, John Carroll High School in DC, and he was 2 years ahead of me. And so I've known Boyd a long time, hired him to work with me at the RNC. He was in our administration. And Boyd is Boyd. He's his own style and his own self. There are very few like me. I have a friend of mine who refers to me as Malcolm X, and in fact, I have a lot of that sort of burning passion where I'm ready to get it done by any means necessary, and I'm not afraid to go out there on a limb. Others are a little bit more careful, more controlled. It's not like I don't slip and fall sometimes when I go out there. I've slipped and fell a lot of times when I've gone out there, but for me, it's important to push the narrative and push the envelope. Others, that's not their style. That's not who they are. And so I wouldn't expect Boyd to be any different once he leaves office, to express, his personal thoughts and views on things. Certainly not the way I do, or with the volume of noise and loudness that I try to get. My thing, I'm like Cher in that movie Moonstruck, with that scene where she slaps the crap out of her boyfriend and tells him to snap out of it. That's kind of how I approach it. I'm like, just snap out of it and recognize what's happening. So to the point about, how lonely it is, yeah, it's always been lonely. I mean, I was talking to one of my colleagues today and saying, nobody knows exactly how painful this journey has been. To be, reviled by Democrats and considered an Uncle Tom because I'm a Republican and a Black Republican, and been called that many a time, but at times by some former Maryland officials back in the day, in various campaigns. And also to be inside of a party that really just kind of saw me as a token from time to time. You know, oh, let's put the Black guy out there. When I got elected chairman, I had a member come up to me after the election and say, I'm so excited you're chairman. Now Black people will join the party. I was like, do I look like a Pied Piper? You think Black folks are going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh, well, they elected a Black man chairman. I think I'll go join the GOP. And so you're caught in these worlds in which everybody has this idea about you that is nowhere near who you are. As I would tell people in the party, in every role I have, particularly in leadership, I bring this Blackness into the room because I was Black before I was Catholic. I was Black before I was Republican. I was Black before I was bald, right? So I can't cheat this. And so when you give me something to go out and talk to the public about, I'm not going to sound white. I'm not going to sound Republican. I'm going to sound like me. I'm going to bring that. And so that is the hard part of this journey a lot of times, because you oftentimes do that by yourself. It is not easy being the first in the room, because that typically means you're the only one in the room. And when you're the only one in the room, everyone in the room thinks that you are there because of them and you owe them. And they discount what qualities and qualifications you brought to get you not just through the door, but at the table in the first place. And so this idea of, a whole bunch of Black folks showing up in the GOP, not going to solve much, because unless and until you change the attitudes, where when you see them in these roles, well, now, we got one Black senator in the Senate. We got one or two in the House. Out of how many? What year is this? I mean, we had back in the day, just to mention, Jefferson Franklin Long, Joseph Hayne Rainey, Hiram Rhodes Revels, among a whole line of Black men who served in the House of Representatives, right? And yet, here we are. So there's a lot more to it. And I think, the parties, look, I remember discussions with Democrats, and this is to just let people know, this cuts both ways when it comes to the Black community in particular. Back when there was talk about Jesse Jackson was looking to become, because they had the shadow senator in DC, and there was talk when they first created that Jesse Jackson would be ideal to take that role to go to the Senate to represent the District of Columbia and advocate for statehood. There were Democrats who actively worked to kill that statehood legislation because they did not want that Black man in the Senate, as it was put to me. So folks, I mean, you got to get out of your head that, Republicans are racist. No, baby, it's all over the place. And it takes its form and fashion by who's ever in power. And whoever thinks they can control who comes in the room and how long they get to stay in the room. And that to me is always going to be the struggle, which is why I advocate so much for the young people who get to see this conversation. Tell your history, make that part of your story, because that's how you begin the conversation in the room when you show up. And when the institutions and the establishments try to reframe it as something ugly, CRT, and dangerous, CRT, or unnecessary, CRT, that's the time you say, excuse me, I got an extra hour I want to share with you. Take off the jacket and plan to stay. Carve out your space, tell your story, because your children and your grandchildren will be grateful for that. And what you will find in doing that, in establishing your space, that you will be connected to others who are doing the same, and you won't be alone. Our disadvantage over 4 years is how they've kept us separated, how they broke up our families, how they institutionalized our men, how they mistreated our women. Look at how they're responding to the possibility of a Black woman sitting on the Supreme Court in 2022. Folks, you would think this is 1922 or 1822. So understand that history. Listen to the professor when she's telling you the stories, when she's informing what you already know. And take that and put that as the centerpiece of your narrative as you begin to write history. So you begin to write history. Because I can tell you what it's like to stand on the steps of our Capitol in this state, up in Annapolis, and know that as I'm taking the oath of office, as the first African-American to be elected statewide in the 360 plus years of this state, that just behind me, down the street, as we like to say, on the corner, Kunta Kinte was brought to this state as a slave. So understand that relationship in your space, in your place in it, because you have a place in that relationship. Yeah, a lot of you are going to be the first at what you do at some point now or in the future. That's okay. Don't get caught up on that. Just take it, put it as part of the story. But because you have a story to tell, you have more to talk about than just being the first.
Chairman Steele, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate what you had to tell us. I'm sure all of the students and every one of us that heard you, you've given us some food for thought and something for us to remember for quite some time. And don't milk yourself a stranger. We'll see you soon.
I look forward to coming back on campus, baby.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Take care, Doc.
Sorry, I just really quick.
Good. That's what's going on.
You did say